Hey guys, welcome back to Seller Sessions. It is part two with Steve Simonson, covering on from part one of a four-part series. Steve, welcome back to the show.
Happy to be here, Danny, as always.
Cool. Remember, guys, for those listening back on the podcast, this will be available on YouTube. There'll be show notes. They'll be on the Awesomer podcast. And of course, you'll be hearing it through the Seller Sessions podcast as well. So without further ado, Steve, should we get into this?
Let's get into it. So everybody, if you caught part one, we're doing a little mini series and we've broken it down into four segments where the first part is kind of review of context of how we got here. This part is going to be kind of about data and triage. And then we're going to add additional kind of data points and then even some speculation in subsequent parts. So don't miss the whole mini series. Really, I could sell this as a masterclass, Danny. Like if I was into that sort of thing, this could be a, $200 or $300 or $400 masterclass. And it is really, really important stuff. I think that every person who does cross-border trade should know. You saw kind of a preview of this in London. What do you think?
Yeah, indeed. As I said, how I operate anyway. I don't do like the big mastermind things. Yes, we do seller sessions live and stuff, but I'm like quite free with the content. We publish 200 episodes or so a year. But like what you said, this is more than about money. This is about getting it out to the people so they can educate themselves, not scaremongering, just get a greater understanding. So it gives them a better navigational tools to run their Amazon business.
Indeed. And in part one, I left a little bit of a cliffhanger for everybody. And essentially the question was, what happens if we're about to go through the same thing in COVID, the sequel that we did, back 18, 19 months ago? And that's a scary question. But again, as Danny said, this is not scaremongering. This is preparation, right? Awareness leads to preparation. And then you can consider what you want to do with your business. And I'm going to give you some ideas right here as we get going. Now, here's some things that you probably have heard. Danny, have you heard about the energy crisis that's happening in China?
Yeah, as of a couple of weeks ago, I think Sharon did cover some of the information on it. But yeah, there seems to be, it started as like a rumor come out and then the news stories started to appear. And that was 2 or 3 weeks ago where it started to peak.
Indeed. Yeah. And just so you know, the peak is still coming. This also happened last year. For anybody who is kind of paying attention, this happened last year, but to a lesser extent. So anybody who wants to believe the kind of greenwashing stories coming out of China, how they're doing this to reduce coal reliance or any of that, it's all nonsense. They don't have enough coal. They don't have enough, which is called thermal energy, which is 2/3 of their total economy.
Yeah.
In terms of power. Nuclear is maybe 5%. There's some other pieces mixed in there like natural gas and renewables even. But the whole point is this is a problem, and this is going to lead to a bunch of factory shutdowns. In many cases, our factories have gone from 6-day-a-week production down to 2 to 3 days, which is like having production. Have you seen reports about this?
Yeah, I've heard about reports of it as well, like full shutdowns for some people, depending, because factories don't always work off a great margin. And if they're struggling to get the materials in, they can't mass produce anyway. And then there's on the flip side, you've got other factories that have gone down to part-time and just getting out and cranking out the door what they can.
Yep. And by the way, this is not the only problem, right? There's a handful of COVID cases happening in China. And in August, for example, 7 districts were labeled high risk and 191 districts in China labeled mid risk. These are kind of party jurisdiction or party districts, not cities or what have you. They cover more than one area. But like my team right now, in many cases, can't travel even from city to city in China. Yeah. The problem is zero tolerance leads to extraordinarily unpredictable supply chain. And just so you know, this is not just limited to cutting power at factories. It's hitting homes, it's hitting hospitals, it's hitting red lights, the traffic signals. This is more than just a passive problem. And it will continue all winter long until we get back to, maybe April. Yeah. By the way, COVID is going to continue to disrupt because it's not just China. Our stuff in Malaysia is jammed up. Our stuff in Vietnam is jammed up because, again, many of these countries have adopted this zero tolerance perspective. And of course, Ningbo had one person, maybe it was up to 4 people, but it was less than 10 people tested positive for COVID in the Ningbo port, and they shut down the entire North American and European terminals in that Ningbo port for 2 weeks, which created, that's their 5th biggest port in China, and it just created absolute additional pains. Did you have any stuff come out of Ningbo? I don't know how much you do out of there, but it hit us pretty hard.
Not me personally. Right this moment, just for clarification, I am not an Amazon seller. I sold through my brand over the last few months because we're launching a glassware brand in the US from January. So I'm one of the people that are holding off. I'm waiting for some of the chaos to calm down. And then we've got 6 products lined up for that. So as I speak, I am not an Amazon seller, and it's been like that for a couple of months.
Well, it's a good time to be on the sidelines, let me tell you.
Yeah.
By the way, these strict lockdowns have a cost to them, not just, the obvious cost of disruption and so forth, but like just even testing. So I don't remember the exact count of people, but dozens of people in the Wuhan area, the Hebei province, were tested positive for coronavirus. That's led to a population of around 20 plus million being tested 5 times. Yeah. Just the pure cost of those tests and the disruption of people and locking them down in their houses has substantial, not just financial costs, but there are other, kind of unpredictable costs. But again, the ports are choking. This is today. This is not 18 months ago when all this started. This is today. And we've got these realities of people now locking their houses in China again, as the Delta expands, and the little love notes we get from various companies. In this case, Singapore does a lot of electronics, and they can't get enough stuff, so they're going to miss a bunch of Christmas shipments. Yeah. Nike has said we don't have enough shoes for Q4. Costco said we don't have enough toilet paper, and we can go around the world to find these shortages. This is not unique. In fact, I think if most people go to their store shelves, they're going to see small, in Western countries, it's small, maybe 5 to 15% impact, lower quantities or rationing of some level. Have you seen any of that in your area, Danny?
I haven't personally, no.
That's good. So in Western countries, we don't see very much, but in the less developed world, it is much more impactful. And believe me, inventory wins in Q4. If you have inventory in Q4, you will be much better positioned than your competition because it is going to be hard to move stuff. And then, of course, as I said earlier, China.
Or should we say, Steve, fully optimize programming for your inventory in Q4? Because you can have a load of inventory, but if you messed up your timings and are not on the beat with everything, it can be quite much more of a disaster. But yeah, those are who have optimized their 3PL and they're keeping a razor sharp eye on everything in terms of when they should be replenishing stock.
Indeed. Yeah. As a matter of fact, just to add my 2 cents on that point, having inventory means it's saleable, it's shippable, yes, right? And so course. if you have inventory sitting off the coast of Long Beach, waving high to the Christmas season as it goes by, not so good, right? Yeah, and if you don't understand how to move into 3PLs and these types of kind of ninja tactics you need to take, because Amazon keeps changing the rules, you're less in a position to win, regardless of how much inventory you've produced. You've got to have it ready to sell. And that is part of our mission, is really to encourage you guys to be sophisticated about it. By the way, I just like to clarify, because I heard a couple people over the course of the last month, they said, well, Steve, really, isn't China just doing this to be more green? They feel guilty about burning coal, and they're really trying to be better, global citizens. And you don't take hospitals offline, you don't take factories, or you don't take homes offline. It's one thing to say, I'm going to shut down some factories to go green, but this is not what that is.
And when you look at, I'm not sure if it still stands now, but if we looked at searches, internet searches online, in China, it's money is the #1 search online. So that gives you an indication. Whereas in the West, it's sex. Not to throw some shade there, but you can see the difference between the two. So if they're thinking about going green and their #1 search is money, I think that's probably going to be quite false in terms of what you just said.
Well, and so you have just applied one of the most important lessons that I've learned in my life, which is watch what they do, not what they say.
Exactly.
Right.
Actions.
And when they do these factory shutdowns, but we all know that the quest for financial freedom or money or ambition is running amok, particularly in China as a cultural touchstone. No criticism, by the way.
Yeah.
And I should just point out that Danny and I are huge fans of the Chinese people and their extraordinary accomplishments. Speaking just strictly from a observation perspective, I have no issue with whatever the Chinese people want to do. I've got some issues maybe sometimes with the government policies, but I got issues with my own government policies.
Look, if that's someone's culture, that's their culture. Let them get on with it. It's not our problem. We've got our own things to worry about. Don't worry about that. I was just giving an example of when they're talking about going green, and it's very much in China. People are motivated by money and business and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just what their culture leads on.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, that's precisely an observation that is happening and reasonable. So here are some facts, right? Zero tolerance is actually one of the biggest problems that is slowing down the recovery. Say what you will about, the United States, even the UK to some extent, we remained largely open. We had our periods of lockdown and they took different forms at different times. But I was just in London, and it's one of the freest places I have ever witnessed during this whole process, right? It's as free as Texas or Florida. Despite, kind of rhetoric and kind of policy, even postings, people were largely just walking around as free citizens. And that's because they have a high vaccination rate and other things that we don't need to get into. But the opposite is zero tolerance. That's not working. And it's crippling economies. Malaysia, Vietnam, etc. New Zealand, just ask them how it's going, because they're abandoning ship. And so is Singapore.
Yeah, I spoke to friends in Australia. They said in Australia, it's the longest of the lockdowns of all. I think it was up to, at that point when I spoke to them, it's 236 consecutive days.
Which
barely
is
any
insane.
cases.
Yeah,
insane.
It's really unacceptable.
The psychological damage that will do to their nation. We won't see that be unprecedented. That's going to be, you'll see that in the next 2 to 3 years.
I totally agree with you. And that's, it goes so deep, and unfortunately we don't have time to get into it, but that is one of the biggest things that is as yet uncalculated and was quite unintentional, right?
Yeah.
Nevertheless, it's happening. So Singapore is abandoning it, and they have a spike, but they're not quitting. COVID zero is done for Singapore. More and more in Asia, people are saying zero COVID doesn't work. New Zealand has abandoned the policies I just mentioned, and China is mostly worried about that. They're like, if they're, not doing that, what does that mean for us? They have remained largely in the zero tolerance, entirely in zero tolerance, but yet they're trying to have.
Again, we know from history and their culture is that that's almost an expected thing, and that's what people expect. You can't run zero on the US and the UK because no one will tolerate it. And that's the thing. They will simply not tolerate it, and we won't have militia out and doing what they would do in China and the UK because it's against human rights.
Right. That's exactly right. And so just to put a fine point on this, if China's zero COVID policy continues, it will worsen their debt problems for the companies inside of China. And really, part of the point here is that if it's a lose-lose, right? If China maintains the zero tolerance, we're going to have unexpected pockets being shut down for as far as the eye can see within China. And if they abandon it, it could be a massively negative impact to their health and welfare because they don't have all the infrastructure needed to cope with the inevitable cases. If Delta has shown us anything, it's that everybody's going to get this thing at one point or another, even if you don't know you got it, which is for every people who are asymptomatic, the estimates are 4 to 5 asymptomatic people for one kind of symptomatic person, and then a very narrow percentage of those get very, very sick and worse. But both of those are lose-lose for China, right? If you lock down, you got problems, and if you don't lock down, you got problems. So I don't relish their position, to be honest. So Danny, now we need to talk about what do people do. Now, triage is a word we use here in the U.S. So do you guys use triage?
Triage.
It's a French word, so that's why I ask.
Oh, it's not something in my vocabulary.
All right, so triage. I'm glad that we get this chance to share. Triage, again, I say it's French, but what do I know? It's in a hospital setting where a patient comes in and you got to do triage, which means as fast as we can figure out how to save the patient, right?
Yeah,
it's the fastest things that we want to do to try to help our business. And this is the 5 things that you guys need to do as sellers right now. And I'm going to go through these things relatively quick, but it's really important that you think about doing this actively in your business right now. So these are action steps. The first thing is asking your supplier to cooperate with you. And I will just tell you, I'm going to give you these ideas, but it's harder now than it was before the pandemic. It's harder now than it was a year ago. It's harder now than it was 6 months ago, because there are things happening in China, which we'll talk in subsequent parts of this mini series, that are dramatically impacting their ability. Your Chinese factories, your partners over there making your products, it's affecting their ability to conduct business. But in principle, these are still things that you need to consider asking for and ask for cooperation. That's an important word in China, cooperation. So making sure the price quotes that you get have an effective date that's farther down the line. Even ourselves, where we buy some pretty decent volume, we're only getting price quotes to hold for days, not weeks or months. Of course, if you are paying down payments, ask, hey, can we remove the down payment? I'll just pay you when it ships, if that's how you do it. And beyond that, what if I pay you nothing down and I pay you 60 to 90 days after it ships? That's how we do.
Do you also, but you're in a different position, but there was a time where, 60, 90 days after shipping and stuff, factories are willing to work with that. But with the pandemic, the shortage of materials and the crisis now, I think, and I may be wrong, there are people out there who are paying up front just to get their nose in front on stuff. So they're kind of working towards people with, well, if you pay us, we'll put your products out first. But in your position, Steve, you got not the luxury, you built your own business, but you're in a position where you've done all that history, huge volume, and they probably wouldn't want to lose you as a customer. Not that you want the pain to switch in, but for smaller sellers, they will struggle with this. Would you agree?
Indeed, I totally agree. And just to be perfectly clear, the suggestion Danny just gave is exactly what we will do, right? Sometimes we will pay faster than they expect, or we'll even pay a little bit more to move to the front of the line. That's how China works. Whoever pays fastest pays more, often wins, particularly in this climate. So even as I put this out there, and I do want people to understand what Sinosure is and to be able to cooperate with their factories long-term on payment terms, but today's reality is cash wins. There's a lot of risk. They're having to pay all their people even faster. And so liquidity gets rewarded. But knowing this process, because this works anytime, anywhere, you can ask for these things. But here's part of it, and I'll get to the punchline here in a minute. For every time they say no to something, they are closer to saying yes to something else. Right? And so when they say no to the first 4 things, maybe they will say yes to number 5, where they give you a DDP price, which means deliver, duty paid, and they become the importer of record. You'll be shocked at the economics that they are able to get on that versus you. And I'm not going to go into the details on that, but let's just say that is something you can put in place right now. Ask your supplier for a DDP price and compare that to your DDP that you can get on your own.
Indeed.
So it is harder to get these right now, but these same concepts apply to any supplier anywhere in the world at all times. And then maybe one of the 2 suppliers you use for the same item will say yes to 2 of the 5 instead of all 0 of the 5. I do want to emphasize that if you don't have history or volume, you lack leverage or leverage, as the British might say. So if you don't have volume, you can't make unreasonable demands. Relationships pay the dividends. Unreasonable demands get shut down hard. Right? That's basically exactly Danny's point. Okay, the next thing that I highly recommend you do is, particularly for freight right now, is run RFQ processes. This is request for quotes for those not in the lingo. And we think of, getting shipping as a system, right? So we will go into our computer and we will make a request for quotation. It will, include messages and terms, very specific details about origin, destination, HS code, weights, every single thing that they need to give a proper RFQ. And then we will send that out to a number of shippers. In this moment, shipping is a big point of problem for us. I mean, our shipping costs have quintupled. That's, tens of millions a year potential problem. And by doing this, you make sure that you're paying the most competitive rate because it's a market. And secondly, you open yourself up to wider capacity because you can get the lowest price, but if you can't ship it, it doesn't matter. What do you think, Danny? Did I lose you?
Sorry, my mic was muted. I said you're stuck. You're limited by the resources around you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And this is part of the point is capacity wins. So even if you had to pay $2,000 more for a container that actually arrives in time versus one that is going to stay stuck, you have to make those decisions on the fly. So
and also manufacturing and having stuff on the factory floor that you're storing there in China itself.
Correct. This is, again, many times we will say, you know what, go ahead and make 3 containers worth of the stuff, but ship one this month, one next month, and one the following month. And then if sales exceeds, we can push those things forward.
Yeah.
So thinking about that. Now, I understand capital and I understand timing. We can't always do these things. Once you get an RFQ completed, it's going to have the same level playing field for all the shippers, right? They know all the details they need to know. In our case, they log back into the system and they tell us what the price is. And then we make decisions based on timing, capacity, price, and relationship, not just price. Let me be clear. Okay, so that's process 2. Process 3, Danny, is lawful tariff and code, HTC or H code, whatever you guys refer to it. This is where you try to make sure that you're using the best code that you can. And in the case of, a shoe, as just one example, Danny, there are 436 ways to classify a shoe.
Yeah.
And a boy's running shoe. Oh, go ahead.
It's going to say, I can't remember who it was, but one of the leading Adidas, Nike, whatever, but they had something to do with something on the tongue of the shoe or the sole. And they were able to switch the code over, which dramatically reduced it. So it's worth going, what you're going to say is to go through the different codes and optimize where you sit in there, because sometimes you could be spread across a few.
Yeah, precisely right. In fact, Danny's example there, Converse shoes throw felt. Yeah. They throw felt on the bottom, and those, a shoe import is 27.5% duty on that, but imported slippers range between 3 and 12%. So just by throwing felt on the bottom, that defines it as a slipper. And in this case that I mentioned, in a boy's jogger, right, a boy's running shoe, if you just change the top of the shoe to include more textile instead of leather, it cuts the duty from potentially 37.5% to 8%. Yeah. It doesn't take long to get creative. And by the way, visually, often people can't even tell the difference. Performance-wise, they can't tell the difference. So you have to think about engineering in a fruitful way.
Yeah. And
just to give another example, in a women's shirt or blouse coming into the United States, it can be as high as 26.9%, but it drops to 16% if they put a pocket below the waistline, right? So these tiny little details can become a big difference for you. And one final, go ahead, Danny.
No, I was going to say it's probably going to be a massive fashion burst there, because obviously fashion clothes goes in a series of seasons across the year. So there'll be a lot of people walking around with low pockets. Yeah,
and again, if you don't know that by adding a pocket you can cut 10% off your duty below the waist in this case, then it's hard for you to compete against the competition that has that. And this should lead you to ask questions when you're ordering your competitive items and you see something that doesn't make sense on the item. Start thinking, is this related to tariff and HTS engineering.
Yeah.
And the example we gave earlier about the Converse All-Stars, again, just fuzzy lining puts down or on the sole of a shoe, has no functional benefits, but it cuts your duty, by as much as 10 times. It could be a 10x cut if done in a certain way. So I want you guys to think about that. And one final example is if you make a non-waterproof jacket, it's 27.5% duty coming into the US, but just adding water resistance, which costs you maybe 4%, maybe up to 6%, that lowers the duty down to 7%. So you save 20, you might spend, 5 or 6 of that on the waterproofing, but that little detail, you've increased the feature, maybe higher perceived value, and you've lowered the duty substantially.
Yeah.
These are important things. What do you think about all that, Danny?
It's a lot to take in, but definitely for optimization. We just had a friend who sold their business, and one of the things is when the codes come up in the deal in discovery, there was going to maybe knock off maybe half $500,000 to 750 grand off the value. And then they went back and got some legal jargon and stuff together and worked with a specialist, and they were able to get that added back in because it was passed from the discovery team and the hires up to sign off on the deal. So they, by making one phone call and working with an expert to make them adjustments, they gained back what they lost of 500 to 750K.
Yeah, it's a great example, right? So we're thinking tactically of day-to-day profits and P&L basis, but all of that, especially when you exit, has a massive multiplier effect, right? Yeah. And so there are specialists, there are law firms, there are specialty companies that help you with that. You don't do it on your first day in business. Just do your best and work with your factory and work with your freight forwarder. You don't have to be an expert on day one. But over time, you need to get better and better and better, and make sure that your competition doesn't know things that you don't. Because if you are selling jackets and they're paying 20% less in duties than you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, I've also heard, and I need to confirm this, but I'll share it anyway, and people can look into it themselves. We're talking about add backs now with the adjustments in the markets as well. If you were to sell the business and you paid high freight at a period of time, the market regulates. The brokers and people like that are always checking for add backs to put it back into your business. So then obviously you'll receive that because the market itself is regulated, or it could regulate in that period while still going through the sale.
Yep. Very good point. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons to understand your numbers and also have very good resources as you go through the process. By the way, the fourth method here is to consider relocation of your supply chain, right? So there are lots of big companies that are considering this. Nike, moving a lot out of Southeast Asia into Africa. Apple moving a bunch of stuff into India. There are lots of examples, of Microsoft and GoPro and Black & Decker all doing stuff in either other countries or even into the United States. And then, Under Armour is a great example because they're shifting to places like Jordan and Vietnam and Philippines, Indonesia, places that might not be on the top of your, I don't know how many people go, I should make some stuff in Jordan. But if you're in the textile business, there are some advantages. And we'll talk more about this in the next segment, but as you think about your product, you think about where your product is sold, your primary market. So that's the geographic area of sales. And then your mission over time will be to try to get the raw materials and the production as close to that market as you can. And the key there is raw materials, which we'll talk about later.
I just want to quickly cover for people, if you don't mind, Steve, from your perspective, you've done some relocation stuff.
Sure.
The problems with not just the cost of labor and everything, the problems of relocating to the US, could that be ideal if you sell on .com because it's the biggest of the Amazon platforms, right? But what are the big, you must have looked into this. What are the big problems? Because I don't see on your list, if I'm right, I've seen Texas on there. That's it pretty much. That there's one company, which is Dell, moving 30% to Texas. But what are these impacts if people want to spend 6 months trying to find factories over in the US and stuff to look at it? Are they completely wasting their time? And what will they come up against in terms of costs and problems?
So this is a complex question, and one that we're going to get into subsequent segments. But I do want to just emphasize that you can't just flip a switch and go, well, I was buying this, consumer-based product in China, and then I said, oh, well, I just called the Factory USA hotline, and now I got a guy. Yeah, he's a little bit more, but it's easier for me. That's not how things work in the real world. China, their strength came from making it easy. It's like, can you make what's in this picture? Like, yes, we can, right? Kli, that's how the Chinese say it. Yes, we can. And so you can't just simply replace China because you have a mental shift. But I will tell you that the U.S. has 3 critical things going for it that China does not. Again, in segment 3, we're going to talk about. But you need power, you need raw materials, and you need people. And also, the U.S. has a neighbor called Mexico, which we're going to get into. And there is a way to do this, and we'll allude to some of those things. I can't tell everybody how to do it exactly because it's complex. But my whole point is you have to start thinking now about what does your supply chain look like 3 years from now. It's not just a switch. You have to start learning. You have to think about how you make stuff. What are the actual processes? What are the core raw materials? And then how do you put all of that in? Where most Amazon sellers were just, hey, I found something. It looked like it would rank well, and now I'm selling it. That's fine to get started. That's fine to prove the concept and build the resume and build cash flow. But over time, if you're going to do volume, you need to start becoming more sophisticated.
Indeed.
All right. And by the way, one of the big reasons why people are moving is the U.S.-China political tensions, which I don't know if those get any press over there in England. Have you ever heard of this?
To be honest, I don't read much press, and I barely watch the news on the TV and stuff. But I don't think it is is it impactful for a UK that it is for the US? Because obviously US is heavily driven by news anyway, and they need a lot of news stories. And you've got multiple channels like we have in the UK, but the newsreel in the US is much more aggressive, much more going on than I would say the UK.
For sure. Yeah. And I do think that, it's well known that the U.S. and China are kind of economic rivals, and more they're thinking of, kind of where that Cold War will go. And that's problematic globally, and we'll talk more about that later. But point number 5 on our triage list is watching your margins, right? The old saying, revenue is vanity, profit sanity, right? It doesn't matter how much turnover you have if you can't keep any of it and invest that into new products and inventory and so forth. So price go up. I absolutely guarantee you that there will be inventory and pricing, winners in Q4, particularly if you understand to hold. So you have 2 options, really: increase prices to deal with increased shipping and raw materials and inflation, or hold prices, which lowers your margin, and try to take market share. If you take market share on a single-use product with no customer funnel, what have you gained, right? You've only gained the kind of disposition of that inventory out the door, and it's been a transaction, but there's nothing that's equity. If you're selling something where they're going to buy it again and again, that may be a good strategy. Now, again, there's the long-term flywheel of reviews and ranking and so on and so forth. So I'm not taking away from that, but I do want you guys to think about margin. I do want you to think about price. What do you think about that stuff, Danny?
Yeah, I think across the board, because, as I said, even though everyone's in the same shit, right? So it's a level playing field. So at some point, there's going to be a price increase because no one can hold. They have to support their margins. And if they have to increase the price, people will follow. There are going to be some people that hold off longer because they've got more cash on hand to try and ride it out. But I just think that people may need to accept slightly lower sales, but focus on their margins.
I definitely am a believer in making money for all this work that you're doing. There are strategic times where you can, do lower margin, even no margin sales, but your business doesn't work if you don't have, contribution margin.
You're not in business. You're running a liability. If you don't make a profit, you're not in business. You're out of business.
Yeah, that's completely right. So really, this is kind of the end of this, segment number 2, part 2 of our little mini series. In part 3, we're going to talk about the underlying causes. So most of the things we've talked about are symptoms. Obviously, COVID is an underlying cause, but inflation, that is a symptom of a problem. Power problems, that's a symptom of a problem. Labor costs rising, that's a symptom of a problem. We're going to talk about the underlying causes of what we've already kind of gotten into and really describe why this is a strategic problem coming up for the next 10 years. And again, no part of this is like, light your house on fire and run for your lives. This is get smart, get educated. We're trying to train you all as the executives, the CEOs of your business, so you can lead your team into the future. Danny?
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree. So we'll sign off now, Steve. Thanks for this one. Don't forget, this is the DUALcast through Seller Sessions podcast and also Steve's Awesomers podcast. Take care of yourself and your family, and we'll be back in the next episode for part 3.